Interrupted mail. We all know what that is, we think. There's four kinds we're covering in this presentation from an airplane crash. Otherwise used to be called crash covers, but then they decided to group them all together with railroad train fire covers, shipwreck covers, and simply suspension of postal service. It's all under the title of interrupted mail. So here's one of the more popular crash covers available in Canada, the TCA crash cover, a Moose Jaw. This is the partially burned cover from a flight in April of 1954. And here's the back with a very unusual district post office inspector cover or postmarking. The actual plane was a prop liner and flying over about 6,000 feet over Moose Jaw. And the tail was clipped by a RCAF Harvard flying in the opposite direction, and the tail of the plane was clipped off. Both planes crashed, killing all 35 on the TCA, the trainer pilot, and a woman on the ground into whose house the fuselage landed. Here's the other plane. Obviously, these aren't the actual pictures. They're just similar pictures to what the planes that were involved in the crash. Here's the letter contents from the Ancient Order of Foresters, just a few days before. Now it's reminding him his $4 in dues is requested, but it does have an interesting statement, very appropriate. The funeral fund is well over 100% solvent. You may recommend our sick benefit and funeral benefit plan to friends with every confidence. How appropriate on a plane crash. And the Ancient Order of Foresters ultimately became Foresters Financial with various areas of financial business. Here's the ambulance cover. It carries the injured letter to its original destination. They put the letter in it. The addressee's information is transferred from the original, and then it's sent to the addressee together with this apology. The enclosed article is salvaged from mail carried on TCA plane. Any damage occasioned the contents of this item is regretted. Here's, in the aftermath, there was an investigation, of course. The new regulation was implemented requiring aircraft flying in opposite directions to maintain separate altitudes. And if you're traveling anywhere from 0 to 179 degrees, anything with a hint of east, you have to be at an odd elevation. And if you're traveling anything from 180 to 359, you have to be at an even elevation of 36,000 feet, for example. These are just examples. Moose Jaw Public Airport was relocated away, and they changed some RCAF rules. Now, here we have four more covers. These covers have come up fairly frequently, and there's a lot of them available in the secondary market. And so here are four of them. So the question is, what's the collective noun for a bunch of letters? You can call them a stack, but that implies they have to be physically arranged in a certain order, right on top of each other. We'll come to that at the end, but we can think about it in the meantime. Here's another crash cover from an RCAF fighter plane, the Dakota, and was salvaged. There aren't too many of these fighter plane crash covers available. This is an old Douglas C-47 that was adapted from the DC-3 by putting a big cargo door on the back, and they shortened the tail so that it could also be pull gliders, and they reinforced the floor. Temiskaming to the Veteran Wives Club from January of 1985. Getting information on these crashes is pretty tough. Here's in 1955. This is a year later after the TCA crash. It's a portion of a salvage crash cover from a Norseman float plane that was just doing mail. There's an interesting write-up on the article. It took off from the airport and then quickly crashed very close to the airport in a ditch filled with water. And fortunately, that water was incremental. In fact, it was right beside the road. There was a taxi waiting at the airport, and two of the brothers of the pilot managed to get in the taxi and drove, and they got to the plane in time and were able to pull out the plane. Interestingly, in this article, which is you'd expect it to be accurate, they don't mention anything about 3 passengers, but the official investigation, the official report of this refers to that it was overloaded and there were 3 passengers in the plane too. I don't know which to believe, the investigation report, which says it was overloaded, or the newspaper report that doesn't make any mention of 3 passengers. Here's the plane that's also featured on one of our stamps. Here's the cover. Here's the contents. It lists dates and places where someone has to go. And of course, the apology letter, salvaged from the plane, which was crashed and burned near La Paz, Manitoba. 1970. So this was Air Canada Flight 621. When the plane crashed at landing in Toronto, not all passengers were killed. Interestingly, this cover was mailed from Algeria to a personal friend, Rose, and she graciously gave it to me in 2000. So she had kept it for 40 years, and she knew I was a collector and gave it to me. And it's very nice to have a personal connection with a crash cover, because most of the time we don't know anybody involved with those. Here's the newspaper article, right up. The pilot and the co-pilot, they each had different strategies. And the plan was that when the pilot was commanding the landing, it would be his method. And when the co-pilot was doing it, it would be his method with the ailerons. And well, they didn't do it right. They didn't agree. And so simple pilot error there. Next category was interrupted mail. Going to be a train fire. Sellers research suggested that it could be from a fire in a baggage car attached to the Toronto, London, and Windsor train on December 23rd. It looks like it could easily have been a Christmas card. It's the right shape, size, a little bit of coloring in there. So there's no back stamp. We have no indication to confirm it, but the date would fit. The stamp has obviously been damaged by water. And so that was the idea. Now, the shipwreck mail. The RMS, I have a longer presentation on this. I've just got a few slides on this one. Owned by Canadian Pacific. 170 meters long, 20 meters wide, and 11 meters deep, basically. And the RMS Titanic, quite a bit longer, a bit wider. 1,477 passengers, approximately. Crew of 420. It's interesting, this ratio is almost about what we would see in modern cruise ships. Crossing trip 6 days, about 170,000 passengers on those 192 trips. If we consider that 50,000 of them actually were immigrants to Canada coming this way, and those 50,000, it's 4 or 5 generations later, we could easily have 1 million people who could trace their heritage to forefathers coming over on the Empress of Ireland, on one of the various ships of one, I guess, the 96 different one-way trips coming this way. It had 300 first-class passengers, cabins for 300 first class, 500 and 450 second class, 800 in third class. Some of the second class cabins could be either converted to first class or third class, depending on what the mix of customers and clientele was. $30 to $35. How much is $35 in 1914? Here's what we see. Statistics Canada publishes that per month in the summer season, including board, for males, it's about $35. Females, $18. So it looks like it's about 1 month's males' farm worker wages in 1914. I can see why people struggling to make ends meet in UK could come over if they heard that this is the deal. Canada's Titanic. Now, of course, it left Quebec 1914 in the late afternoon on its way back to the UK. Dropped off the harbor pilot at Pointe-au-Père. Saw the coal ship coming in. Fog came in. A few minutes later, Stormside rammed the side and Empress sank within 14 minutes. 1,012 people died, 465 survived. The death toll was less than the Titanic's 1,514, but in terms of passengers, it was more. 22 more than a Titanic's 818. Titanic lost 700 crew members because it took so long to sink. There was a lot of time to get passengers off, and the crew weren't allowed off or couldn't get off. and they gave the few lifeboats they had to passengers rather than crew. So, and there's this sinking very close in the middle of the St. Lawrence River, not too far from the main border here. Here's a piece of shipwreck mail. It's got a green stamp on it. There's the back. Here's the second piece of shipwreck mail. This is addressed to the London Glove Company, Cheapside, New London. And it got put into an ambulance cover and addressed again. And they both received these purple hand stamps. This one somehow got a 2-cent Admiral that had a RPO CDS on it. I think it just soaked off and was in amongst the letter. So they decided, oh, we'll stick it on and make it look like there's a stamp, but it's obviously not the right stamp and never was on that envelope to start with. So we call those ambulance covers. Wow, this carries a dead letter. There's a returned dead letter from the dead letter post to the dead letter office. Call those dead letters. If we call these ambulance covers, what do we call these? How about a hearse cover? Okay, now the fourth category of interrupted mail would be this temporary suspension of postal service. 2020 postal service to Qatar was suspended because there were no planes, no flights coming into Qatar. Mail was sent with this return to sender was RTS with a special 2-part label. So my daughter sent this to me in Qatar, and then when it got back to her and she resent it again, I received it back in October. The original cancellation was much earlier in the year. Here's an example of what the label looks like. And if after it's removed, this is what it looks like. So it's an interesting, I guess it should be considered as interrupted mail. I considered strike mail, but that's not really strike mail because eventually it is RTS. It doesn't ever make it to the strike mail. When Canada had postal strikes, it just got returned to sender and it never really ended up at the addressee's place. And I think we come back to the final question. Here are 4 examples of interrupted covers: a plane crash, a ship sinking, railroad fire, and a service suspension. What do we call what's the collective noun for a bunch of letters? Like we talk about a pod of dolphins or a herd of deer. Any ideas what the correct term is for a thing of letters?
A clutch?
It is actually a mail of letters. French word mail, which means mesh and refers to the mail bag carried by the postman. There's also a German word that also has an MAL. It's a Heideutsch, a Hochdeutsch word, but I can't find it in any dictionaries. This came from my mother, and this is the source of dictionary word origins. There might be some other origins and collective nouns for it, but that's the presentation for today.